Yeah, my host here is Emily Laudon, who was a PhD student in glaciology at the Arctic Center, University of Lapland. That's how we met. We started there in 2007.
Yeah.
And finished 3 years ago.
12, and then 1 year.
Yeah.
With you?
Yeah. So since she's been here, I've been planning a sabbatical at Dartmouth for a while. And I said, when I finally come, I'm going to come visit some U.S. colleagues. So I was at Penn State last month. I was in Tufts University in March. I was last week in University of Virginia. And this week here. And next week I'll be talking Dartmouth. I haven't actually spoken to Dartmouth yet. I've been there since August. So my host there was like, hey, Bruce.
Time's running out.
You're leaving soon. I know. We got to get our pound of flesh. So it's nice to be here, and I'm very sorry to miss Kendra McSweeney, my friend and colleague from actually going on 30 years ago. I started at McGill in 1987, and she was in one of the first undergraduate geography classes where I was a teacher's assistant doing cartography and remote sensing and stuff. And Kendra was one of the sharpest crayons in the pack, I gotta say, and still is, I'm sure. So I wanted to start with the update on what you all probably saw a couple months ago, that 2015 was the warmest year on record, followed only by 2014. So the statistical likelihood of having two of those back to back is
They're
just
saying already, by the way, that the first 3 months of this year will be the warmest continuation of that. So already...
And because I'm in the Northeast this year, I was experiencing, we had the warmest November and December on record, those back to back. So I was riding my motorcycle on Christmas Day, actually, in New York State. And so I assume people are not familiar with this part of the world, so I put in a map to show where I'm going to talk about. It's Northwest Eurasia, and I'm coming from Rovaniemi's up about here in Lapland, and I'm going to talk a bit about Sami reindeer herding today, but I'm going to talk more about Nenets reindeer herding. And Nenets culture exists on both sides of the Ural Mountains, so it's the same language, but I'm going to talk particularly about this area today. And this is the borderline for Asia, so when you take a train from Moscow to Salakar, you actually go up through Komi Republic, come down here, and you cross over the border there, and there's a little sign in the Ural Mountains that says Europe, Asia. So there's huge oil development here and gas development here, and I'll talk about that, but I'll also talk about the retreating sea ice and the warming climate and the implications for icing of the pastures that is leading to mass starvation of the reindeer there, and big changes in the way they operate the system. But I'll use for comparison the Sami system here, which is also Europe's only indigenous people, and also reindeer herding, but managing their livelihood in a quite different way than the Nenets, who are, this looks like seen in the western prairies in North America, 19th century, but this is actually 1991. My first trip up there in last summer in Soviet Union, and it still looks like this. So you don't see motorized vehicles out there. You only see them down in the south near their headquarters where they have a slaughterhouse. This is up in the northern tundra, actually not far from the Kara Sea. So if we go back to that map, this is up around between the Bovenenko gas field and Cape Harasave, so about 72 degrees north. And so that's a typical scene there. The reindeer herd, this is summer chum with no reindeer furs on there. We'll see the winter chum later, and I'm describing the so far preliminary findings from a 4-year project. The acronym is RISES, for Resilience in Social Ecological Systems of Northwest Eurasia. And this has been funded by the Academy of Finland with different partners. Mainly in Finland, but also in Russia. We have Russian archaeologists and paleontologists, ecologists in the region working with us. And our team is based in Finland, but we include obviously Americans and Germans it's a polyglot group, but the issue is weighing non-climate versus climatic drivers in human-animal relations over diverse timescales. On one hand decadal and on the other centennial. So that's why we have to work with archaeologists, because this is the permafrost region here. So there's no permafrost here, but only some paraglacial features. But starting about here, we're in the continuous permafrost zone here. So that means little twigs of wood like this would be well preserved until last year. Last year we started to experience thawing already in July to the depth, to the bottom of the active layer, and the wood started rotting. So we're now in a salvage archaeology phase here, which is very worrying. And these are some of the research questions. First and foremost, is climate change really the dominant driver in Northern Eurasian pastoral social ecological systems? So meaning societal transformation change. This is a big narrative now that climate change is happening now, and the Anthropocene is happening so quickly that people will not be able to adapt. But we're looking at past climate change and past societal changes to see how they have done this in the past. And the big example we're using is the transformation from hunting reindeer to herding, which took place during the time period of the medieval warm period. But we hypothesized that that was not the driver. So what role have people and animals played? At what time and spatial scales? An example would be this meadow you see here. The normal vegetation type for this area is tall, erect shrubs, willows. And you don't see any willows here because they've all been trampled off and grazed by the reindeer. So you end up with these meadows. And that is, it's by the engineering effect of that many animals concentrated for long periods of time. It's actually one of the signals we look for. When did these meadows appear in Sami and then in systems? Because that, when they're in close proximity to a hearth, you would say those are not wild animals. Oops. So we look at the examples of non-climatic drivers, reindeer governance, legislative regimes, markets, and surprises. And I gave the example of Chernobyl yesterday as a surprise, which led to a major shakeup in particularly the Swedish reindeer meat markets in 1986 and the immediate. It's still feeling the impact. So they're measuring, last week they were out measuring the becquerel counts of the meat as they do every year. And then last, what are the main risks in coming decades as perceived locally by herders and administrators, and how have the past climatic and non-climatic pressures been managed? So we're comparing these in the two regions, northernmost Europe, and these photos are from West Siberia. And our main methodological approach is participatory research. So we work with herders side by side in hopefully all the research phases. It doesn't always happen in every project, but we try to do it that way. But reindeer management is generally top-down. You see the EU flag here. Finland joined the EU in 1995, and Sami herders were already complaining about the restraints from carrying capacity management from the Finnish government. Then a lot of the rule making went to Brussels. So Brussels was telling them how much their animals need to weigh and how many they can have. Northern and rural areas did not vote EU. The vote was very close. It was almost like an election here in the US, 50.1% to 49.9%. So this top-down governance is still in place, so people don't really trust government regulations. They have deep mistrust in the way the pastures are managed, which is mainly with carrying capacity models using Landsat imagery to estimate pasture productivity. So an ideal participatory project would have indigenous herders involved in all the planning, field work, the data analysis and interpretation, and the dissemination, including writing up. And right now we're designing a mobile museum exhibition that's based on the shrub, just on the shrub component of the work. We're working with greening of tundra shrubs, and we're building that now in Rovaniemi. Then we'll send the blueprint to Salikard in Russia, and it would be built there. And again, this will be with clips and participation of the reindeer herders themselves. So this is a Sami reindeer herder here who's been working with us through different projects for about 15 years. And he worked on the original research grant that led to that book in the Springer Ecological Studies series, but he's still working with us. So there's some older photos here of building fences and then more recent photos. So setting up met stations and doing monitoring of albedo, snow cover, soil temperatures at different depths, and so on. And I put a photo from November 2014, early November there, and late October here. And there's a huge difference because we went up to this site to set up these met stations by four-wheelers, which is normally impossible in late October, but in recent years, this is becoming the new normal. So herders who actually, we ran a series of workshops last year, and the herders who are now young guys and then women, the older herders who are my age are telling them what normal winters are like, and they don't know what a normal winter here. They only hear the, oh shit, there's another bad winter. And they don't know what a normal winter is, these young herders. They really they don't know what the older guys are talking about because they just see one bad winter after another. Bad meaning ice encrusted snow where the animals are not getting enough food. So we use the NASA GIST website for averaging temperature and precipitation, and I put temperature trends here over a 40-year period, and you can see about a 2 degrees Celsius, 1 to 2 degrees Celsius warming in much of the areas. In some of the areas, it's on the order of 2 to 4 degrees, particularly in winter and particularly over the Greenland ice cap and northern Canada and the Arctic Ocean. But also spring warming, fall warming, there's annual warming, and here's summer warming. So depending on what you're looking at, if you're looking at shrubs, you start looking at summer, but we've actually seen now that winter warming is also having an impact. Things like fungus forming below the snow because it's actually getting so warm below the snow cover. And indigenous peoples observe a lot of these things. They originally told us about the shrubs growing taller when we weren't even looking at that. And then we started to go look at things that we otherwise wouldn't have thought of. So that's what participatory research ideally does, is gives you new insights and research questions. And that's really when you understand that the herders are like scientists too. They're looking at this stuff and going, we're not sure what's going on here, but we have an idea what might be driving it. And then you can set up experiments with them to try to test that. And they have traditional ecological knowledge, it's called. We call it more like IK or indigenous knowledge, because whether it's traditional or not, you get into, but they're using skidoos and rifles, it can't be traditional. And, we don't go down that path. We just ignore that. Knowledge is knowledge, whatever you want to call it. So we made a short film clip for by the European Environment Agency for the COP15, and it's actually a Swedish Sami herder talking about the impact of the rain on snow. And this herder I wasn't working with at the time this was made in 2009. We'd known each other for a long time, but now we're working together, not in the RISES project, but in another project funded by the EU. This is about him and his family and their experience with the rain on snow in recent years.
A lot of people have view of nature, that nature is cruel and hostile, but I think that nature has, like a human, different sides. Sometimes it's on a bad mood, sometimes it's on a good mood. So I think that to accept both the good and the bad parts of nature, then you understand nature. So I think a reindeer herder has learned to accept both parts and always to adapt, either it's hot or cold or good weather or bad weather. So in one way you're adapting.
The Sami people have practiced traditional reindeer herding since the 17th century. Reindeer herding is more than a profession. It's a way of life.
The life of the reindeer herder, it is partly it's very hard. Because during those times that the reindeers are really migrating, moving from one place to another, or the most intense working parts. You can have up to 2 or 3 days without any sleep. Then if you have bad weather at the same time, so sometimes it's very hard, but often, and the most part of the reindeer herding is a very nice way of life.
So it's intensive herding since the 17th
To be a good reindeer herder
Evidence of
requires many
domestic animals
skills.
going back much
First and
further.
foremost, the herders must know their reindeer. This comes from close observation of the animals throughout the year. The herder must know the behavior and movement of the reindeer and understand how wind, geography and climate will affect their behavior and movement.
Reindeer herding is a form of agriculture and meat production, and this means a very narrow set of issues from a management perspective, but from a Sami perspective, there's a lot more involved in terms of culture, and one of the problems is it's just not so profitable anymore, and climate change may make that more of an issue. It may decrease the ability to make enough money to even keep reindeer herding.
The reindeer herders used to live in a lavu, a portable tent that is the house for the family. Today they live temporarily in the mountains in small solid houses. During the winter, the village is mainly inhabited by the herders, but in the summer all the family live there. 83-year-old Nils Thomas Labber is the oldest member of the Labber family and is today retired. He's been a reindeer herder his whole life and has been able to observe big changes in the climate. I want to speak about the changes in the weather, the changes from earlier times until now. The first snow came in October. That used to be normal. Today, in October and November, there is rain and wet weather that creates an ice layer. This ice layer does not melt, it stays the whole winter. A cold winter with deep snow is very bad. It is when reindeers starve to death.
The things that the climate scientists started predicting in the 80s have now become a bit more normal. We could even say that the fall comes later. The permanent snow on the ground is coming later each year, and the springs are coming earlier. That means snow is melting out sooner, and it also means the temperatures just aren't as cold in the winter.
The warmer and wetter autumns are making reindeer herding especially difficult. Today, Nicholas Lapper and his older brother are running the family business and can see the direct effects of changes in the climate.
If you have a condition that is coming more and more often now, it's rain on ice. If you have a layer of snow, about 15 centimeters, and then you will have a rainfall for one day, it will eliminate the level of snow. The snow will go together. And of course, the water will go through and go to the bottom. Then that water, if there will be a cold weather, will freeze to ice. And that surface would make that the reindeer can still cross the surface. But then you have all the light and everything is inside ice. And when the reindeer eats that one, it will get too much water in the stomach, and then it will die. If it will be forced to eat. The losses during a winter with no access to the soil, it can be catastrophic. You can have 10,000 reindeers in an area. During that winter, you can lose up to 90%. So you cannot do anything because the stomach system of reindeer is that it doesn't have the right food level all the time, the terrorists die, and then you can't do anything.
The increasing frequency of what we call, scientists would call rain on snow events or thawing and refreezing events. This has become more widespread across the northern hemisphere, but of course here where we have reindeer herding, that's a big issue. Another one is more snow coming later in the winter. That means that you have deep snow in the spring, and it's harder for animals who are already weak, maybe from a couple of these icing events. It's harder for them to dig through the snow and get to the fodder.
The problem with water on snow is it's a very enormous, it's a very serious problem. A lot of areas now, reindeer herders are trying to get artificial pooling to get the reindeers to survive. Yes, that is a short-term solution, but artificial fooding will not be a long-time solution because there is not the economy to get the fooding artificial.
The first global review of reindeers has shown that populations are declining almost everywhere they live, from Alaska and Canada to Greenland, Scandinavia and Russia. Over the last 20 years, numbers worldwide have plunged by almost 60%.
For Sami, the main challenges for climate change come in two spheres. One is the direct interaction with animals, making sure they get enough feed and survive the winter in a healthy form and give birth to healthy calves. The other comes from the other land users. This is not just the Sami area. There's forestry, there's tourism, there's all these other things going on that we can't ignore and the Sami can't ignore. So if we add climate change on top of that, it's another level of stress and another issue that may make it, if it's a marginal livelihood already, just maybe making enough money to survive the next year, climate change may be something that can push it a little bit over the edge.
So unfortunately, soon after this was filmed, both Nicholas' father and his uncle, father's brother, passed away. So I mean, talking about indigenous knowledge, a lot of their knowledge, of course, was transferred, but those older herders really have a lot of knowledge because they actually grew up in the time before the snowmobiles came, what we call the snowmobile revolution. So they have different sets of knowledge about snow and language that actually isn't used anymore. Because the Sami have a rich language about snow. They'll tell you that not all that is used anymore because the way you experience snow on a snow machine is different than walking through it and cutting through it with a reindeer. So going back to West Siberia, the reindeer itself is an icon, but also provides much of the provisional ecosystem services. So food, they, unlike Sami, they eat raw reindeer meat and drink the blood. They're using the clothing. They're using for shelter. This is the winter chum with the reindeer hides on the cover, and then also companionship. Some of the reindeer in Finland, this would be called kotiporo or home reindeer. They also have the same. They are ones that are so accustomed to humans that they'll come right inside the chum when the insects get bad, when the wind dies down. So what you forget focusing on the reindeer is that people also eat fish actually most of the year. In the summer they're not killing the reindeer at all actually because the skins are wasted. You see how ratty this reindeer looks in the summer. They use all the skins, so if a reindeer breaks its leg crossing the river, which actually happened when we crossed this river, one of the animals got stuck in the mud and snapped its leg. That can't be, in some cases, if it's a small reindeer, you can carry that reindeer for the rest of the migration, but a bigger reindeer, no, you have to put it down right on the spot and consume that meat quickly because it's going to rot very quick. So this is the Boaniklo gas field developing here, which is the first and largest gas field we developed on Yamal. It's the one feeding the Nord Stream pipeline that comes into Europe. So people have adapted since 1988 over about a 25 to 30 year period to a lot of this new infrastructure and pressures in real time. So we've been studying the aspects of resilience at that time in the context of oil and gas development. And now the conversation has switched more to this extreme weather and climate. So we're seeing resilience in a different context now that we actually weren't looking at when I started the oil and gas work up there in 1991. I was looking at a very different set of variables. But since Soviet times, the rhetoric has been about mutual coexistence, meaning that people and reindeer, like they love to use this, Gazprom loves to use this kind of imagery showing and saying that people can coexist. But actually, it right now is working pretty well. This people migrating right through the gas field here. You can see the trucks and the power lines in the background here. So they actually, few of the brigades have so much of the gas field is actually right on their territory, so they have to cut right through the middle of the gas field in the middle of summer. It's right in the middle of their summer pastures. But when you're there, then it's all about fish. Fish is the main source of protein when people are on the move. So when you get to camp, people first, somebody has gone ahead the night before and put nets in. And then when you arrive in camp, immediately they check the nets, and this is the brigadier. It's kind of like the Inuit sharing. The brigadier gets all the fish, and he decides who gets how much, distributes the fish, then everybody goes back. The women start immediately gutting and salting the fish because it's freshwater fish, and after it's cooked with the salt for a little while, then you can eat it kind of like sushi, actually. But you don't want to eat it completely raw because you could have worms there. But they use hot mustard and other condiments. So all this knowledge has to be passed on to the next generation. So the elders who manage these areas, they do the migration. They'll move once every 72 to 24 hours, depending on the number of animals, the condition of the pastures, and what stage the animals are at. They have to get to the coast before the insects get bad or the calves get they'll be too harassed by black flies and mosquitoes.
So how much of the movement is sort of reindeer doing their own thing, and how much is...
It's both, and there's a tension there because when you have a lot of reindeer, they'll try to do what they want to do, and what they want to do is get into the wind. And you see how flat it is here? There's not a lot of high ground, so the competition for the high ground is intense because that's the first place they'll put a gas rig or a workers' camp. It's the first place the herders will put their own camp, and it's the place the reindeer will go to get their face into the wind. That's what they're desperate to do. Like, just like you, if you're there and the insects are bad, you do the same thing. So there's this tension of trying to control the reindeer, and they use people and dogs to do that because they don't have any fences separating them from the next brigade or private unit. They do mix sometimes, but the idea is not to let them mix because then you have to go in and extricate your own animals by sight. They don't have any ear markings or very few. So the elders manage a lot of knowledge about the condition of the lakes and rivers. They are using a rotational regime that they don't have it written down anywhere. It's just here, and the kids have to learn this by doing. And they are doing that well. So we actually compared, during the oil and gas work, we were comparing the Nenetso Krug and Yamal, and Yamal is actually coming out better because they still have nuclear families. In Soviet times, the women and children were removed from the East European tundra, and that's caused big problems. The move to shift labor really rearranged things in a way that Yamal, you still have the kids are in boarding school during much of the year, but every week and month they can be, like during summer and long holidays, they are out in the tundra and they learn by doing. They don't learn reindeer herding in a classroom. And this is the beginning of the greening work, because when we were doing this oil and gas work, social anthropologist in the same institute, Florian Stammer and I, started getting testimony from herders about the shrubs growing up. And they said this was happening kind of before their eyes. The same campsites they visited in the 70s were starting to, some of them were turning into these thickets of woodland and actually getting up over the tops of the animals so an animal could functionally disappear into the thicket. And if that happens during a migration, you have a problem. And we just had a Nordic Center of Excellence finish last year with funding from Nordforsk, or Nordic Research Council. And in that, we were looking at how we could actually exploit the reindeer to keep the shrubs from growing up. Because when we were doing the IPCC chapter on polar regions, we were using the data on albedo, and that is, as these shrubs grow taller, they change the snowpack. They also start sticking out of the snowpack, and then when the spring comes and the sun starts to shine brightly, you have functionally 20-hour daylight already in early May. and that's still winter up at high elevations or high latitudes. But it also makes the tundra functionally darker. So there is a little bit of research on that in Fennoscandia and Greenland, and now some more papers on that from Nordic countries. And meanwhile, the areas are characterized as overgrazed. The administration in both regions, Fennoscandia and Yamal, say that the number of animals is too high, it's been too high for far too long, and that the territories are degraded. And this is their yardstick for degradation, is actually lichen cover. They measure green biomass, for example, in the Yamal tundra and here, by a combination of field visits. In Yamal, it's once every 10 years they come out and do a biomass survey. But particularly in Fennoscandia, where these pictures are, this is Norway and Finland, they use Landsat image. I use a Google Earth image here, and this is an Econos image here, just to show the lichen cover difference along the border fence. So they built a border all the way between Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Russia in the late 1950s and early 1960s. That meant the borders that had actually been drawn up in 1851, the reindeer couldn't actually cross anymore. They wouldn't let them go to the coast. So these animals in Norway are here in winter, and then they leave before the snow is gone. So they actually have to paw through the snow to eat these lichens, whereas these animals in Finland, they were suddenly locked here. So they come in the summer to graze in these riparian areas and mires, but when the wind stops, they go up onto the high ground, and when they go into the high ground, the lichens are dry, and they shatter and break and blow away and wash away. And so this has been called an ecological disaster in Finland, and the Sami are to blame. The Sami say, we didn't put that fence there. We didn't decide this was going to be summer pasture. So they take the fall for, they've been taking the fall for this in the media for a long time, but it's called overgrazing, but it's really the disappearance of lichens from trampling in summer. And it's not just here in the northernmost districts. This happened a lot in the 80s when you had demographic shifts in herding, with particularly young women leading, but also young men. So you had fewer herders managing larger herds because meat prices were high. And then to get to these, to cross to the summer pastures, they were walking across the transitional pastures. When they walked across them, they trampled all the lichens. And these grow so slowly, it's taken decades for some of these areas to recover, but they are recovering slowly, but still this is it's not so much consumption of lichens. So we shouldn't talk about overgrazing, we should talk about heavy grazing and trampling, and then we should talk about alternative stable states that result. Because they're pretty much universally characterized as bad. So for the University of Arctic makes short videos, and they did one on tundra greening, and it's about 3 to 3.5 minutes. I think, yeah, and I'll
So I'm Bruce Forbes. I'm research professor in global change at the Arctic Center, University of Lapland in Rovaniemi, Finland, and I've been in Finland 19 years and lead the global change research group there. So I've been working in the Russian Arctic now for about 23 years, but 10 years or so ago, while doing oil and gas work, in nomadic Nimitz reindeer herders living on the land began to talk to us saying that they noticed the shrubs were increasing, and this was in fact affecting how they manage their reindeer on land. And we thought, okay, that is very important knowledge, but how can we make that
see the dogs there.
in a way that scientists and the public can understand? So we do, on the one hand, research on the ground, migrating with reindeer herders, talking to them about change. On the other hand, we have very high resolution satellite imagery with us in the field. What we're finding now actually is that in situ shrubbification or foresting is happening, so that relatively knee-high or low direct shrubs, we call them, have within the lifetime of the herders grown up over the tops of the antlers of their animals. This means if you're moving camp every 24 hours and moving with thousands of animals, animals can actually disappear into thickets of woodland. So the Nimitz were right. Their observations from when they're teenagers to now my age, say early mid-50s, This has happened in their lifetime. So this is why it's an issue now, because there's
Same thing happening in
on the one hand, there's climate-related changes going on, more icing in winter, rivers freezing up later, breaking up earlier in the spring. But you also have just issues of the vegetation change. And one final point I'd make is that this entire area where we're dealing with has been classified as moderately to severely overgrazed. But the satellite indexes in the ground level studies show it's actually becoming more productive. So we have a bit of a paradox there, and that's our next thing we're working on, again, with the reindeer herders, is what does overgrazing mean? Because there's political context and how reindeer herding is managed, but humans and animals are affecting landscape level vegetation cover there. From a scientific perspective, we're getting a handle on this for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC. What's interesting from an IPCC perspective and a public attention to this is there's important feedbacks from greening of the Arctic, because as the Arctic comes up from shrubs into a forest, it's got a lower albedo. So the potential for more incoming solar radiation and more heat retained at the ground level is important. It would melt snow sooner, and we do have green up coming sooner in the spring. We have freeze up coming later in the fall. So the issue goes to the IPCC, and is in there because of this, the potential feedbacks of the tundra turning into forest. That's important to understand, and that's what we're trying to go the next direction with this.
So we're doing parallel work in Fennoscandia that started with willow and alder, and I'll show in a minute, has now extended to junipers. But interestingly, when I went into one of these areas that's now forested, they were milking goats until, or milking reindeer until the early 1900s. Then they started milking goats, which actually produced more milk, but goats strip off the vegetation even more than reindeer. Then after World War II, milk became widely available, so they got rid of the goats, and since then the forests have grown up in a lot of these places very quickly because there's not enough reindeer there to keep them down. And I started doing this dendro work, dendroclimatology, dating these, and the oldest ones I found in one of these villages were actually from 1946, right at the end of World War II, which is when they got rid of it. And I searched all over. I was trying to find the oldest ones to get the longest dendro record. So we couldn't get air photos of the areas in Russia, and we started to look at that. Led us to look at the dendro record to see what the herders were telling us, that the shrubs seemed to be A, growing faster, and B, growing up taller and developing its woodlands. And we found not only were they right, but these woolly willow or Salix lanata and also alder on the sort of coast turned to be very good proxies for reconstructing summer temperatures. We were surprised how good they were, and also that the growth regimes were teleconnected, meaning that the high pressures over West Siberia that appeared to be driving the increase were opposite when there was a low pressure in Fennoscandia, and they were switching back and forth. And the herders had been kind of telling us this too, that they weren't saying high pressure systems, they were saying the summers are getting longer, they're getting hotter, there's less wind. And then you look at the satellite data of NDVI and you see, yeah, the green up is coming earlier, plants are senescing later, and some of the plants are even switching into having two reproductive cycles. The summers are so long in some places. So it's really shaking up this a bit, but it's really, when we talk about greening the Arctic, we've got to remember the IPCC summary said it's only about 30% of the Arctic actively greening. Most of it's static, and about 4% is actually browning or becoming less productive. So the other thing we're doing with the herders is oral histories. We've been, because of there was an icing event in 2006-07. We were there. Florian Stamler was there during the first event. I was there just after the second event. And then another one in 2013-14 winter that killed 61,000 reindeer. And we started talking to the herders about their memories of these. And we started seeing that there was some correlation between what the shrubs were doing. For example, the shrubs in summer 1997 did not grow at all. They put on zero woody material, actually almost dying. And that's the year after the 1996 event. So the icing-cased pastures, the Sami herder were describing, are the same thing you would see on the mall. You see pastures that are this hard. The animals absolutely cannot get through that. So if you imagine what that herder is describing, 15 centimeters of snow, which then turns to ice, and then it goes back to minus 30 or 40 and stays there all winter, that ice is still going to be there in spring when the willows start growing. Or in the case of 1997, they don't seem to be growing. So these pointer years, and then the 1993, 2012, 67, these would be anomalously high growth, putting on a lot of woody biomass. And so the herder's memories of the events went back almost to Vasily, who we'll see in a minute, actually talked about events his grandfather had told him about. And they went back to the beginning of the 1900s. And we started to see these this is our 100-year chronology based on willow from Yamal, from this is colleague Mark Macias Correa at Geography at Oxford. And this is from the laboratory of Pentti Zetterberg. This is just a snapshot taken from his PC in his office showing 200 years of juniper growth. We just started working with the juniper last summer. So this is a photo taken last summer with Timo Kumpula, Mark Macias Correa, and I up at that same site you saw on the Finnish-Norwegian border. This is the exact same place. So it's a mountain birch tree line here, and these are the birch trees, and they're hard to see here, but these kind of blob or poodle-shaped things are the junipers. And we were excited first because we started to think, wow, these junipers are living 200 years. We're doubling our dendro record right there. But this was actually a month ago. Now we actually have 5 individuals over 300 years. So we're really getting into deeper time here. And we're not complete yet enough to run the stats, but we did see differences, which is what the top slide shows between the sandy ground, the ones growing on sandy ground and the ones growing on rocky soil. Their reference to temperature is roughly the same. You see the same trend line, but interestingly, the median age was about 100 years different between sandy ground ones who were living median age 250 years, and the ones on rocky soils were living median age 150 years. So big difference in that. And this is what these look like. So these are hard softwood. The birch are considered also relatively hardwood. The willow are very soft, but cutting through this is really a a hard job. And this is a really nice, easy one for looking at under the microscope. Normally they're shaped like, they can be really wonky shaped and very difficult to actually trace the dendro record, to count the rings accurately because the rings are so oddly shaped. But Pentti's done a remarkable job with that. So we're not at the point of analyzing the juniper data, but we've been pooling all the deciduous shrub data with a big group called the Shrub Hub. And the leader of that is Isla Meyer-Smith at the University of Edinburgh, and we put our data in from everybody we could get from around the Arctic. And you notice these are our data here from West Siberia and the Nenisoka, which shows they were the most sensitive to temperature, and all the data from all the sites, all of them showed that the ones growing on wet soils were actually reflecting the climate better than the ones on dry soils. And now I remember, then I start to think the juniper growing on the dry soils were actually not living as long. So there seems to be a relationship there between the robustness of the individual and the sensitivity to the climate change. And I tried to show this animation yesterday, and I'm going to give up on it today, showing it through PowerPoint, and actually tried to download this last night at Emily's. And I put it in because it shows a period from 1987 to 2013, the loss of the multi-year sea ice. So these are average monthly, 12 months in a year, and it's showing this Barents and Kara Sea area where we've been focusing, there's no multi-year ice. So these are the last areas to freeze up in the autumn and the first areas to thaw out in the spring. So this is the place where you'd expect to see an impact of retreating sea ice reflected in the terrestrial ecosystems. But that's not what we found. We found the shrub growth was actually related to the synoptic pressures over West Siberia, which so far we haven't seen them connected with sea ice. But this anomaly of 2007 wasn't there. Now you see the anomaly of 2012 here. And by 2013, almost all the multi-year ice is gone. So this is a case of a huge amount of heat buildup in the Arctic Ocean that's not going to dissipate quickly, but the fact that it does dissipate means that it's going to lead to less and less multi-year ice. Just as long as that heat is coming out, and as long as we have more open water, we're actually going to continue to be absorbing more heat in there. And how much time do we have?
Well, good boss.
Okay, well, I'll continue at this speed because I didn't get quite through everything yesterday, but I mentioned at the beginning we were putting our West Siberian work in the context of the transition from hunting reindeer to herding reindeer. And the oldest evidence for semi-domestic animals is somewhere around the 4th century up in the tundra. There's older evidence further south. There's also Stone Age sites further south. Up on the tundra in Umal, it's more Iron Age sites. But up around the 10th century at a site called Yarte 6, which was, it's out in the middle, south central part of Umal, you start to pick up things like children's toys, and the toys are those sledges. They're carbon copies of those, or scale model copies of those sledges I showed, which indicate they had sledges and patches of decorated reindeer harnesses. Again, observed perfectly in the permafrost. But if you want to argue that climate change is driving that domestication, you'd be hard pressed because there's lots of periods that look not too different from the 10th century. People were experiencing a relatively warming climate over a period of a century. But the Little Ice Age, on the other hand, and the medieval warm period are much more pronounced at the level of the northern hemisphere and in the North Atlantic. These are all multi-proxy data average for the whole northern hemisphere. You really see the medieval warm period stand out, and you also see the Little Ice Age stand out. But the Little Ice Age here on the wall is not very remarkable, but it is a long way from the Atlantic, relatively. You've got the Kara Sea relatively disconnected from the Barents by the Nova Zembla, almost coming down and joining the mainland. So this is been in the background of our mind, is that why is domestication intensifying in the 10th century? And we hypothesize that it's actually more to do with socioeconomic drivers and cultural relationships between inland and coastal peoples than anything that was going on in the climate. Although the climate was warming, so conditions were relatively ameliorated, but you as humans, we put an emphasis on what we experience in our lifetime. So if you were experiencing life in Northern Europe in the Little Ice Age, these were not unfamiliar scenes. You know, the Flemish masters were painting scenes like this, and you look at the British art from the time. The ice fairs on the Thames are well documented because the Thames actually froze many times during the Little Ice Age. And you read about Queen Elizabeth. She was actually out shooting archery in 1564 on the Thames River, you know, shooting at marks. So this is what people were accustomed to then. And now when we had, the last time we had this a few years ago, everybody was like, oh, wow, this is so, you know, remarkable that you can skate in the Netherlands. And it's like, well, actually, you see everybody skating out here? These are actually all Dutch paintings here. So it's what we get used to in our lifetimes that we think of as normal. And I said the young herders now are thinking that this warm icing and these bad winters, one after the other, this is normal for them. They don't understand what the old guys are talking about. So this is Vasily, one of our elder herders. He's actually a former brigadier of a large brigade. Now he's privately managing 2,000 animals. He lost 1,000 animals in the icing event of 2013-14. During 2006, 2007, the previous worst event, they also lost a lot of animals, but not as many as the last year. And actually, this was the result of 2 icing events in a 48-hour period. And again, my colleague Florian Stamler was there to document this, so you can see the little shrubs and the ground there down here. But this crater was not dug by the reindeer. This was dug by people smashing through the ice with shovels and anything heavy in camp they could use to try to get the animals, prevent the animals from starving. And the backdrop for this is the oil and gas development I was describing earlier. So herders have started to mention that one of the problems is if these icing events are the new normal, instead of once every decade, if this starts to happen twice a decade or a few times a decade, they're not going to have enough time to recover the herd. They have to not only have animals, they have to have draft animals to haul all that stuff, and training draft animals, breeding and training draft animals takes time. So they've actually mentioned that the free use of space, the encroachment of oil and gas infrastructure present actually problems with this, that they weren't worried about the extreme weather until recently, but actually now that they have the oil and gas development, they're a bit more worried about this mutual coexistence, how they can share this same space. And let Vasily, the herder, talk shortly about himself, because he's explaining his strategy for the whole year. He went through the whole 12-month cycle of that year of 2013-14 and how he did so well, only losing 30% of the animals. He's considered a very good herder. So many private herders lost all their animals, and they had to borrow animals from people like Vasily as breeding stock to rebuild their herds. So this is down at the mouth of the Elbe River, and this is up north. And Rosa's then it's PhD student at Arctic Center working with Florian, and Nina, another social anthropologist, is doing the filming. So Rosa's recording this year. And Vasily is just one of several herders, but the strategy, it changes. If you have a small herd versus a large herd, if you're a private herder versus a brigadier. If you're a brigadier, you've got big problems because you have maybe 5, 6, 7, 8,000 animals to manage. Vasily already has a lot at 3,000. So the transition in the post-Soviet time, one of the adaptations has been smaller private herds that are more agile as things change. And by things changing, I mean new infrastructure and also these icing events. In that same interview, he drew this line on the map here, and that was a year ago. That was March and April 2015. We were back there just 2 weeks ago. But right after that meeting, Timo Kumpula got back, and we worked with a colleague, Annette Barch at the Vienna Institute of Technology, and she checked the ASCAT archive. This is a satellite that shows backscatter difference of the snow and ice surface, and it's showing, the red is showing very high reflectance or backscatter to the satellite, which means it's a hard surface. A diffuse snow surface would be down in this range, and this means harder encrusted snow. So it actually, this area of the hard crusted snow conforms exactly to the line Vasily drew, and he actually marked the date. He said it was, I think it was November 9th or 10th of November. So that was the date, Annette was able to go look in the ASCAT archive, and she said this is the difference between the 9th and the 10th of November. So as this event started to play out in the media, they first reported 15,000 reindeer dead in late March, but then By May, they were saying 60,000, and the total ended up being 61,000 out of 300,000 on the peninsula. So about 20% of the population. And I'm reviewing this now for a special issue of Biology Letters, because we had a session at AGU in December in San Francisco on sea ice and Arctic biota. And this was one of the, I presented this as a poster there, but I'm now madly working in Emily's office there to try to get this together, because it's one of my duties by the time I leave Dartmouth to get the manuscript done. So if we review the literature, we are seeing that recent winter sea ice is most pronounced in the Barents Sea. So we're actually working with the snow and ice data people at NASA to see if there's actually periods of open water or broken ice that would allow enough moisture for the kind of events we're seeing. Because some of them were in November, December, which is normal, but there has also been January events. And in January 2007, the last time, nobody had ever seen a January rain on snow. So this is part of what these authors call the Atlantification of the Barents Sea, meaning that warm water that comes over the top of the Nordic peninsula, including Murmansk, coming into the Barents and Kara Seas. This is the last slide in the same area up here, just showing some of the anomalies that these authors have picked out between relatively warm temperatures over the water and relatively cold temperatures here. They have January 2006, December 84, February 76. But now that I'm able to give these dates directly to the people at National Snow and Ice Data Center at NASA, they can start to search the archives. So this is where we are. It's a summary. Warmer summer air temperatures lead to increases in tundra productivity, particularly shrubs, and longer growing seasons. And when we went up there, we thought, we heard the dogma that these areas were overgrazed, but actually, despite the heavy grazing, they're still becoming more productive. Not everywhere, but in some places the shrubs are growing up. In others, the shrubs are still down where the reindeer can graze them. And this was not linked to sea ice retreat. That was, again, the dogma in the literature when we went up there is that the sea ice retreat is causing the greening of the Arctic, but we find it's not that simple. And the summer warming is not the only thing that's important. The winter warming now and the rain on snow events is actually what's leading to high mortality of reindeer and changing the conversation from oil and gas to climate. But we really don't know what's driving this. That's why we're starting to look for areas of open sea ice in winter. And so far, this is mostly only speculation. I don't think we're going to resolve it by this manuscript, but hopefully in the coming year, we get a better handle on this. So this event of 2013-14, killing 20% of the population, this is what people are worried is the new normal now. And if it is, this has major implications for the future of this kind of nomadism. Having that many animals engaged in those long-distance migrations could be difficult. Probably have to reduce the number of animals, maybe can't support so many families, and that's what people were already worried about because of the oil and gas encroachment. So that conversation about the oil and gas infrastructure hasn't gone away. It's just become layered now with the concerns about the climate. So that's where we are now with the work, and so happy to get comments or criticism, questions, things we could actually look at better. Because this is a work in progress. We were there last 2 weeks ago to present this to the herders, because as I said, we're working with them to get their input and feedback, and we do this as an iterative process. We keep reporting to them, seeing what they think, we go back and look at the data again. So this is one of the guys who actually still had some of his reindeer, but in this area This is summer 2014, so the summer after that catastrophic winter. There was people fishing in this area with their family and kids. The kids were there because it was summer and school was out, but the guy quite frankly told us, when my kids go back to school, it's me and my wife and my brother and his Mordia River. We're here fishing until till we get enough reindeer to go back, because this is about 500 kilometers north of Yarsele and 600 kilometers north of their winter pastures. So they were pretty frank about, we are stuck here until we can migrate, and they need the reindeer to migrate to carry all the household with them.
Well, thanks.
Yeah.
I'm curious, so to what extent in this process, iterative exchange that you have, are they expecting, are they perceiving your role as coming up with predictions and explanatory power?
Well, they've actually been kind of providing the insight about what happens when what happens in an event like this. Like there's no point. You can go talk to the administration and they'll tell you how many animals were counted at the slaughterhouse, but the herders provide the level of detail about what's happening, because all the brigades are different and all the private herders are different. As I said, they range from 100, the smallest unit we work with, private unit is 100 animals, and the largest is about 9,000 animals.
Wow. Yeah.
And so there's huge variation in there. So those stories that they tell give a range of the variation of responses there are to an event like this. Like like one being totally stuck there, and another guy still's got 2,000 animals and is able to loan them out. It's a broad spectrum of responses. So that iterative work is it's for both. They learn from us about what happened to other people that they haven't talked to necessarily, and what they are doing. So they're as interested to hear our stories as we are to hear their stories. Because nobody can be everywhere all at once, and a lot of what happens out on the tundra, there's not much mobile phone coverage there unless you're near the gas field or the railway. So their typical way, like that 2006-7 event, they calculated the size of that event by CB radio calling back to the headquarters, and then out, they would transmit the message out by CB radio to another brigade to see where the soft snow was, because they had to figure out in a matter of hours whether they're going to continue migrating south, or whether they better head back north or east or west, or what they better do. And they don't have mobile phones, so they're all calling in and talking to their brigades. No, this is frozen. No, that one's frozen. No, that you gotta go. And they quickly figured out it was 60 by 100 kilometers. The first event in November, and the second one in January 2007 was 100 by 100 square kilometers. So again, we get some of that information, and they have some of that information. It's kind of an information sharing. We call it co-production of knowledge, because we learn together by sharing what we know when we come. We've talked to people in a different area.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like an exchange. And when you're there in the ground, like in Vasili's house there, we spent, that particular session lasted over 2 full nights, there with dinner and maps and everything, and all the recording going on. But then it takes months to digest all that, actually, because you don't have just Vasily, you've got Heku and Alik and all these other people. You've got tons of hours of transcripts to digest. But meanwhile, they're asking you about, oh, you talked to so-and-so, what did they say? Because we haven't talked to them yet. So it's that iterative process works both ways. It's kind of nonstop learning.
So I found it really interesting to hear the kind of the delicate details about the snow on the ice and sort of the freezing, and how these I mean, if you look at global temperature changes, you can kind of at a very abstract level see that, there's a change, and that's problematic maybe.
Yep.
But when you get down to those details of what really happened, that's when it's like, whoa,
Yeah.
this is really.
Yeah, that's what, like the Sami herder, Nicholas, who was talking in the beginning, he's saying, he said the number of animals for them was 10,000, but he said they could lose 90% in 1 year. And in Finland, these areas, they don't have the long migrations anymore. All the parcels are relatively small by Norwegian and Swedish standards, which have more natural migrations. In Finland, all the areas are fenced in. And that's caused problems in and of itself. And then he talked about this supplemental feeding. In Finland, they started supplemental feeding in the 80s because there was I think it was bad NAO, North Atlantic Oscillation, led to a series of bad winters. Bad being the snow was crusted and they started feeding the animals artificially. And then when they got used to that, because that buffered against calf mortality and pregnant female mortality, and then that became like the new normal, that okay, we gotta have enough money to subsidize the feeding, but Finland, you remember Finland joined the EU in 1995, and Finland has, the territory there, like, this territory with all these small parcels, the actual reindeer herding area goes not quite down to Oldham, it goes like this, so it's about 30% of the country. It's a reindeer herding area. But if you live down around Rovaniemi, where Emily and I were, they can get a subsidy from the EU, and in a good summer you can grow 2 crops of hay. If you've got a capacity, if you've got hay fields, you can get an EU subsidy to feed that to your own reindeer or sell it to some other herder. And these guys who live up here, you saw what that was like. This is rocky tundra. You can't grow, you can barely grow the, lingonberries and other stuff up there. They can't grow any hay. And this is the Sami territory here. So these guys are upset at these guys for treating the animal like a cow. When you're feeding that animal, it's not a reindeer anymore. Our reindeer are real reindeer. They're subsisting on tundra. And you can taste the meat difference between, we get our reindeer from that herder there. You can taste the difference between that and a reindeer in Rovaniemi. In Rovaniemi, they actually have reindeer chow dispensers. If you go to Nivankula, they've got this thing, and it's like the animal goes up there and it grazes pellets out of it. But this is what the agricultural norms do, is they skew towards the people who go the most agricultural and get the subsidies to produce more meat and have less mortality. And these guys up here are like, I don't want to feed my reindeer. You heard Nicholas, he's going like, it's not sustainable, and it's just a short term. That's not solving the problem, actually. So they're smart. They have to be kind of business people on the one hand, but they're very self-aware of the fact that they are not business people. And that these ones down around here who are selling, they have contracts to restaurants in Helsinki and stuff to sell the meat there. They can produce meat on a relatively predictable level because they're not dealing with the level of variability that these guys are up in the rocky, barren zone.
What is the number of people, indigenous or living of the reindeer?
Here it's about 6,000 full-time nomads. In Finland, we've got the smallest number of Sami. The largest number of Sami in the Nordic countries are in Sweden, and they also have the largest proportion of reindeer herding Sami. So it's only about 10% of the Sami who are actually involved in reindeer herding of one form or another. Most of the Sami are living in, maybe studying in Rovaniemi or living in Helsinki, or there's lots of people like that. And then you saw Nicholas. I mean, if you saw him in the street, you wouldn't be able to tell. I would be able to tell probably if I saw him that he's Sami, but to most people they look just like another European. So a lot of people don't identify as Sami anymore, but many who do here, the vast majority are not involved in reindeer herding. So it's a small minority of a small minority who are involved in reindeer herding. So we're talking a few hundred families spread over this. This is the Sami herding area in Finland, and this is the Sami herding area in Norway, and this is the Sami herding area in Sweden. And only in Finland and Sweden, Norway and Sweden, only Sami can own reindeer. In Finland, non-ethnic Sami, so ethnic Finns can own and herd reindeer. And that's why you have this big area of people herding reindeer that are not Sami. They don't have a problem with agricultural norms like this feeding.
Do all of them sell the meat, or is that the main?
That's the thing that since collectivization in Russia and since mostly since the 20th century, here it's become a form of enterprise. It's recognized as an enterprise coming under the Ministry of Agriculture and Forestry. So the regulations are agricultural regulations, but the Sami will tell you, like Nicola said, it's a livelihood. It's not an enterprise. They have to sell this meat, but he also said that you may not have enough money, that nobody makes their money from just reindeer herding anymore here. Here it's more subsistence livelihood, what you saw. And they are fishing. If the fish populations crash here, which was the first threat people worried about when the oil and gas came, is this is going to ruin the fisheries. And it did have a big impact, but here everybody's accepted for a long time that your wife has to be a teacher, or and you have to be an outfitter or a guide, or everybody has to do something else, because many of them are not involved in secondary processing, meaning making sausages and other smoked meats or anything. They literally sell the carcass, chuck the reindeer now to an EU standard slaughterhouse, and it's slaughtered there. And the furs, not all of them are used. Some go to tourism. Some people keep some for bedding and these labus, but a lot of the furs here are wasted. None of them are wasted in the nets because they're using them all. So yeah, the meat is the main market, but from a Sami perspective, that's not the main point. The point is to have a livelihood that is a tradition in your family, and you can pass on to your kids, and you can make a living here, because there's not much to do. The forest ends here. There's some mining and tourism, but really, reindeer herding is the only livelihood that makes use of the natural resources right there. And the vegetation is really poor quality. What you saw there, those low shrubs, and they are very low in nutrient content and very hard to digest. A cow wouldn't last a minute up there. The reindeer has this special rumen that it can digest. I mean, the stuff is like really bad. There's blueberries and lingonberries, very high in secondary metabolites and low in nitrogen and phosphorus. But the reindeer can eat it and make a high quality meat and be out there all year and survive in a pretty tough environment.
And there is no competition with other animals on the food?
Well, predators. Predators. Yeah. Predators are a big problem here now because of the protections of the EU. That, in most of Europe, wolves, wolverines, lynx, eagles are long gone. Here, in bears, here you got tons of brown bears, particularly on the border with Russia, but also over in Sweden. You got the big Laponia reserve here, but all over here, wolverines and lynx and the eagles. And the eagles take the calves and they cycle, but there's so many yearling reindeer here all the time. There's like plenty of food, and the herders get compensated for that, but it's not as much as they would get as selling the reindeer at the slaughterhouse. And to actually get that compensation, they have to prove that it was killed by the predator. So they basically have to find the dead animal and, you know, bring it back for autopsy. To get that, to claim that, to even claim that if you don't find the animal in time and it's just a bunch of bones scattered out on the thing, then they can say, well, that animal could have died of starvation. Probably did. You don't have a carcass with talon marks in the neck showing that the eagle carried this cow. It's very, the herders don't like the compensation regime. The only one that works well is the Poro Yahira Ribaku, which is when you have a car on the road there, you have to get this reindeer and moose collision insurance. And for the reindeer, if you hit a reindeer, as I did for the first time in 22 years, 2 years ago, you have to call the police. The police call the local herder who comes out and preferably finds you and the reindeer. I was on my way to the doctor with my kid who was very sick, so I had to call. And when I talked to the herder, he got there within 15 minutes because I didn't have anything to kill the reindeer in the car. Because the reindeer was suffering because we had, you know, banged into it. I could see him writhing on the side of the road, and I was like, oh, I don't have anything in the car to kill him. And the herder got out there really fast because I called the police and I told him where I was, and you know. And so by the time I got to the doctor's office, I was talking to the herder. So then he gets compensated for that. And again, it's not as much as the compensation for the predator or the slaughterhouse, but you have the animal. You know that somebody hit this, and he's definitely going to get reimbursed something for that animal.
Well, again, thanks for sharing. That's really fascinating study.